I'm Dr. Katelyn Jones, and my pronouns are she, hers. I'm the Women, Peace, and Security Fellow, as well as an ACLS Mellon Public Fellow at the Chicago Council. Thank you to all, and especially to our members for joining us via Zoom for today's virtual workshop on bridging the research gap for inclusive R&D. This program will be partially recorded and available to rewatch at a later date. The small group conversations and networking portion of this workshop will not be recorded. This workshop is in celebration of the launch of a new toolkit I created entitled Bridging the Research Gap, a toolkit on inclusive research and development practices, which was shared with you all in your confirmation notes and is linked as a pre-read on the website. If you haven't done so already, I invite you to take some time to review this resource. It's intentionally accessible, and I hope it will be quite usable and of great help to you. September's Women, Equity, and Global Development Symposium Roundtable conversation greatly contributed to the toolkit. And this toolkit is part of the Council's Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our lead sponsors, Abbott and Horizon Therapeutics, as well as to our patron sponsors, Holthuis Trust, Ashley and Avery McCall, Susan and Bob Morrison, and the Zakat Foundation of America. A reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. So thank you again to all of you for being here today. I'm going to get started with the presentation now. So assuming I can share slides with relative ease. All right, there we go. So again, very glad to have you all here today for this exciting, timely, and important workshop. Before we really dig into the content, I think it's important to give some context for how this workshop and the related toolkit actually came about and why I find this project especially imperative at this time. So I've been passionate about inclusive and equitable research methods and practices since my graduate studies in political science and my time as university faculty. I identify as a feminist researcher, and I'm particularly concerned with how intersectional identities, that is, the interconnectedness of one's gender identity with one's race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and other axes of identity shape institutional transformation, and how institutional changes have different consequences for different people depending on their unique identities. This interest has continued in my work at the Council. I've deepened my training in equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially in terms of work environment and business practices. And what I've noticed as I've expanded my knowledge of and participation in conversations about EDI in the workplace, specifically in terms of human resources and people management, is that the language of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, very rarely, if ever, translates to conversations about research and product development. And for me, if EDI is present in conversations about R&D, the language is wildly different, and it makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to see how the two are connected. So how EDI shapes not only people management in an organization, but also the work product and processes of the institution. So the real goal of this workshop and the toolkit is an introduction to thinking about applying EDI principles, using the language we see in people management in R&D settings. Now, I will say, like, this workshop and the toolkit are a really great starting point to conversations, but they won't reveal everything an organization needs to do to embrace inclusive R&D. That has to happen at a much lengthier conversations within each organization to figure out their needs. But this workshop and the toolkit, I think, are a great starting point. I also want to say that I think the expansion of EDI principles and language into R&D is more important now than ever before, as the realities of systemic oppression are particularly evident in the world and in the United States more specifically. I firmly believe that to overcome systems of racism and oppression, we need anti-racist and anti-oppressive systems to replace them. And I argue that R&D systems are one of those key systems that are a part of that transformation. All right, so moving forward, as I've worked on this project, one of the most frequent questions I receive is essentially, why is it important to think about EDI in R&D? Or why does this matter at all? And there are a few reasons. So One is we know that human-centered design processes save money and result in more impactful products and solutions. So if you're not familiar with the language of human-centered design, I think this is a helpful image to keep in mind. So human-centered design essentially puts design principles and empathy together. So it means kind of how people think about designing products, how people think about designing systems, and putting that in conversation with the principle of empathy, right? So really understanding other people's needs and not assuming what their needs or their identities are. And when you integrate design and empathy together, it results in putting people at the center of the product, which means that human-centered design processes are explicitly focused on understanding, identifying, and helping realize user needs. Another kind of really interesting reason to think about EDI in our world at large is that we see in the international policy space, specifically with respect to peace and conflict, increasing attention to principles of inclusion. So Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has proclaimed that inclusive development is the world's best preventive tool against conflict and instability. We also have seen the United Nations and the World Bank increasing research into how diversity and inclusion can create a more peaceful world. And they actually have found that inclusive processes not only prevent violence, but also resolve violence and armed conflict. And if you're interested in reading more about that, their study Pathways to Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict is really quite eye-opening. Their research has demonstrated that inclusion plays a key role in preventing violence, I would say not only globally, but also domestically, even more locally. And I would say the same can be said of any particular organization or even a smaller microcosm of that in a given team. So with these examples, thinking about human-centered design, thinking about into policy and people worldwide, we see that the principles of EDI is becoming increasingly important socially and culturally. I'd say the past few weeks, we've heard these words thrown around a lot more in our general discourse than we might normally. But as I said before, this kind of language of equity, diversity, and inclusion is not necessarily woven into conversations about research and development processes. So this leaves us with a couple of questions. One, well, what does an inclusive R&D process look like? Right? If we don't use this language and we haven't seen people talking about it this way, what does that mean? Another question would be, what are the best practices to ensure that EDI principles are actually embraced and used at every stage of the research and development process? And these are the questions that in the remainder of this workshop, we're going to be grappling with, and hopefully you'll leave, no, not hopefully, you will leave with answers to these. So objectives for this workshop, things you'll walk away knowing. Ooh, I'm sorry, my mistake. My technological ineptitude never ceases to amaze me. Okay, all right. So you walk away knowing how to explain the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion. You'll also be able to explain and understand the relationship between EDI and allyship. You'll be able to identify key steps, specifically 5 steps that can be taken to ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion are integrated throughout the R&D process. And you'll also have the opportunity to practice engaging in small group conversations about inclusive R&D. So you'll leave knowing how to do. In terms of kind of a roadmap for what we'll be doing today, we'll start off with an explanation of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We'll move on to explore the connection between EDI and allyship. We'll then talk through those 5 key steps in an inclusive R&D process. I'll review what we've discussed up to that point. Then we'll have small group conversations, and I'll give guidelines for how that's going to work at that time. And then finally, we'll return to large group Q&A and a large group discussion. So looking forward to this entire conversation with you all. All right, so equity, diversity, and inclusion. As I said before, we're seeing these words a lot more frequently in the kind of general public discourse. I'm actually going to define the terms in order of their prevalence historically in terms of how we think about diversity and inclusion. So I'll first define diversity, then inclusion, and then equity, because they kind of build on each other. So diversity we can understand as a demographic mix of a collection of people considering different types of human difference, but with a focus on racial and ethnic groups, LGBTQIA+ persons, people with disabilities, women, and other historically and presently marginalized persons. So I also think it's important to keep in mind that diversity is never a single, you can never just look at a single axis of identity. So for instance, grouping all women together and saying we have 10 women in an organization is helpful, but it's more helpful and more kind of reflective of people's unique identities to think about how the identity of somebody as a woman intersects with another element of their identity. So for example, my experience in the world as a white cis woman is very different from that of a Black cis woman. So that's one example. So I say when we're thinking about diversity, to really understand the diversity of a given group of people, you have to look at not only these demographic categories alone, but also how they interconnect for any given person. So diversity we can define, or I'm sorry, inclusion we can define as the degree to which individuals can participate fully in decision processes. An inclusive group is necessarily diverse, but a diverse group is not necessarily inclusive. So this is a trickier part because it's easy to attain diversity, right? To look at those metrics to say we have so many people doing this thing and so many people fit this identity doing this. But inclusion is a lot harder because it involves like adjusting processes, adjusting the environment so that everybody is comfortable participating, and not only comfortable, but also everybody knows that their contributions are equally valued. So that's kind of the next step past diversity. And then equity is is definitely the most complicated piece of the puzzle. So equity involves the promotion of justice and fairness in procedures, processes, and the distribution of resources in light of historic and ongoing oppression. It requires an understanding of the root causes of disparities. So to achieve equity, it involves a really detailed look at not only who's on the team, how that team operates, right, but also kind of what historic and present discriminations and policies and procedures can be corrected to make it so that everybody can succeed. And that involves probably the most work of all. And equity is also, as I mentioned before, kind of the most recent addition to work in what is conventionally referred to as the D&I, or diversity and inclusion space. I think a helpful way to remember these concepts and how they relate to each other is through a pretty simple metaphor. So we can understand diversity as making sure that everyone is invited to a party. Inclusion is making sure that everybody has the chance to dance at the party. And then equity is making sure that everybody can contribute equally to the party's music playlist. If that helps you remember it. But we'll be talking about, I'll be using these concepts throughout throughout our discussion. Okay. So with these concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion in mind, the next question that comes up, well, how on earth can I act on these, right? They might seem like abstract concepts or words that you integrate in what you're writing or how you're talking about things with your colleagues and friends, but how can they actually inform what you do? And for the purpose of this presentation, how can they inform how you act in the research and development space? So I find that one of the best ways to think about how the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion can inform action is to think about them in terms of allyship. So allyship is extremely action-oriented and centers on interrupting and recognizing forms of succeed. So to be an ally, one must recognize one's power, privilege, and supremacy, and then act on that recognition to really be an ally. I also think this is a really important point right now because in the world, at least for me, I feel like there's a lot more conversations about how to be an ally in the present context. And being an ally is more than just saying one is an ally. It's also doing work to understand one's, as I say here, power, privilege, and supremacy, and then acting based on that. And so we're going to talk through that briefly here, and then move on to think about how allyship can inform R&D processes. So to be an ally is to stand next to or behind a marginalized group when needed. Never in front. So I'll say that if I were like in a room and standing up, you would see me. I would like do the movement next to or behind, but never in front of. So what does that mean? So I'll give an example from my own life. So, and I think most people will understand this one as well. So with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has gained increasing traction and is in the news a lot, and a lot of people are thinking about how to be engaged. So me, as a white cis woman, I do not lead the Black Lives Matter movement because I can never fully understand what the experience is for a Black or brown person in this country. As an ally, though, I choose to stand next to or behind that group. And how I do that is I engage in organizations that are particularly working with people who have similar identities to me and who want to be allies. And then we do what the Black Lives Matter movement asks us to do when we need that support. So for me, that is how I act as an ally. And there are different ways to realize that in one's life and work. But it's important to keep in mind, being an ally does not mean taking charge or leading a group that is historically or presently marginalized. It is standing next to or behind. Now to do that, as you know, the image depicts, you have to recognize power, privilege, and supremacy, or you can think of it as PPS. So supremacy is the ideology that one group is better than another group. So we can think of the ideology that men are better than or superior to women, the ideology that white people are superior to Black and brown people, manifesting in white supremacy. Now, supremacy becomes particularly evident in two things: power and privilege. So power is the social capital that one acquires because of membership in a group. So for example, as a white person, I have access to higher salaries than people of color. So that is one way that power, supremacy manifests in my life as power. I have access to that kind of capital. Same thing would go for like schools, right? Privilege is a little different. So privilege is earned benefits of membership in a group because that particular group has supremacy. So we can think of privilege, for instance, as how one's identity shapes the way that one speaks, shapes the way that a person thinks about going to the airport, a space where there's a lot of surveillance, or how one dresses at work, or how one speaks. So me, again, kind of thinking of my own experience, I do not have to think that much about what I wear when I go to the airport as a white person who's not going to be, most likely not going to have any trouble. Whereas if I were a Muslim individual who presented my faith in wearing a hijab or something like that, it would be very, very different. So there's privilege that I have because of my unique identity, and it manifests in those kind of daily interactions and choices I make. So to be an ally, one has to recognize and understand how power, privilege, and supremacy affect one's daily life, and then act on those recognitions to best stand next to or behind a marginalized group when needed. Because the idea is you can't truly be an ally until you recognize how these things affect your life and how the lack of these things shape other people's lives. So it's necessary to think about one's existence and one's allyship in this way to really make a difference and really create a more equitable and inclusive world. And as we'll talk about in a minute, a more equitable and inclusive R&D process. So I'm going to use a lot of this language of allyship when talking about what it means to do inclusive R&D. So here I'm going to talk through 5 particular steps to do inclusive R&D. If you looked at the toolkit, I go into a lot more detail about what these steps might be, what kinds of questions might be considered. I'm going to quickly talk through the steps here and provide some examples that I think are of interest. So the first step is a pretty simple one, and my guess would be that anyone attending this would suggest this as the first step right from the get-go. Build a diverse R&D team, right? So think about who's on the team, what their unique identities are. Again, I would argue with attention to intersectionality, right? And there's a lot of research to support this. So not only is it an ethical or moral good to have a diverse team, it's also a business good. So if you just look at, for example, Harvard Business Review, they've published things all the time about this. So we know for a fact that diverse teams are smarter. research shows that they focus more on facts, they think more critically about those facts, and ultimately develop more creative solutions, products, and research findings. So means not only is the product more innovative, but it's also most likely going to yield more profit. I don't know any company that wouldn't want that. I would also say in building a diverse R&D team, one has to go beyond just kind of counting those demographic categories. As I mentioned before, in talking about how equity, diversity, and inclusion relate to each other, the really key next step beyond diversity is thinking about inclusion. So I would say making sure that people on this diverse R&D team have had EDI trainings. I would even go so far as to say that each team should come up with a list of EDI principles and a system of accountability that they can use throughout the R&D process to make it easier for people to raise any problems or concerns that they might have throughout. So building a diverse team, and beyond that, making sure the team is inclusive would be the first step in an inclusive R&D process. A next step would be to ensure that questions, kind of the research questions, the questions that come up throughout the R&D process, are attentive to EDI principles. So I'm going to give a few examples of what that might look like. So UNICEF, for example, has started in recent years to survey the populations that they want to go and help to understand what their needs are. So instead of UNICEF in and saying, this is what we're going to do because this is what we know you need, they actually ask the population, what do you need? And then work to address what that population identifies. So they've been using a lot of phone surveys for that. Of course, there are problems with that method because they ultimately reach mostly men, but it is this idea that even in the creation of the question and the question that's trying to be answered, including the population affected in that process. There's also a big movement in the global community to gather community-led data. Development Initiatives is an NGO doing a lot of work on this. And for them, they actually go into communities and give them the resources they need to decide which sustainable development goals are most important to them, and then develop a way of achieving that goal and measuring their success, like within the community, not even having outsiders really kind of shape that process in any significant way. So there's a lot of good movement in terms of including the population affected in the process early on. So beyond that kind of initial question development, I also think it's really important that any R&D team is particularly attentive to the language they're using and the questions they ask and how they answer them. So if people are proposing questions with gendered pronouns, I would say, what are the implications of those genderings? Is the research really only concerned with men? Is that why we're using he, his pronouns? Or is it only concerned with women? Another question would be, what is a woman for this research project? Are we, for example, only thinking about cis women, or are we trying to be inclusive of trans women? It's in the policy space, which I'm most familiar with at this point. Typically, when people talk about women in international organizations, the image that comes to mind is most often white, cis women from the Western world who are married and have children, right? So having research teams unpack, like, this is the word we're using, who are we actually thinking of here? And going back and thinking about the kind of intersectional identities that they may or may not be concerned with. And I know that these kinds of questions seem unnecessary or overkill to people who haven't done this before. These kinds of interrogations early on and then throughout the research process highlight the ways that systems of power intersect and shape the research project's questions and its ultimate aims. So I would say these kinds of questions are really, I think, good practice for research in general. So help ensure that the kind of concerns with equity, diversity, inclusion are present throughout the process. And then on a last note related to questions, I think the team early on should have a conversation about, you might hear a siren in a minute, I'm right by a police station. Anyway, the team should have an explicit conversation about the consequences of the project. So asking, for instance, how does this project contribute to a more equitable and inclusive world? And if it doesn't, right, the team might want to think more creatively about the research process itself and how the way that they do the R&D could itself be a contribution to the R&D space, creating equity and inclusion within there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So point 2, and the second step, is essentially to really make sure that the questions and language throughout the process is attentive to EDI principles in some of the ways that I described here. So in terms of like actual research process, the third step, third step is to be attentive to the background research and the citations used throughout the process. So anybody working in R&D is most likely going to consult external resources, external experts. Who is being included in that list of experts? Why? What is the definition of expert? What kind of research methodologies are being built on? Are they primarily research methodologies used in what is often referred to as like the Western world, or white people? Why is that? Why, for example, not look at best practices in sub-Saharan Africa? Why are we constantly using these same policy, these same kinds of methods and question? So being attentive to what the research and development process is building on, and then actively trying to integrate other voices and perspectives throughout, and being really attentive to that. And the result of that, especially if you're publishing any kind of paper or like set of findings, is that in the citations, if you're really being attentive to trying to be more inclusive and include a diverse set of perspectives, you're ultimately going to be elevating voices that are typically marginalized and excluded from the R&D space. And so this is a really powerful way. So even if the project, for example, isn't going to transform the world immediately into a more equitable and inclusive space, this part of the research process is a really important way to create more equity and inclusion within the R&D space. And I think it's quite important. So kind of beyond that part of the research process, another key way, and this is connected, is thinking about the methodology and the data collection. So as I mentioned before, when deciding on what method to use, trying to be inclusive of methods that might not be as prevalent in your part of the world or within your type of organization, and thinking through, well, are we just using this because this is what we've always done or what we know, or is there something that might actually be a better fit? Especially given the aims of the project. It's also really key to be attentive throughout the process to how the project impacts the population studied and most affected. As mentioned before, with UNICEF, including the population affected in the research process, and it can even go beyond, developing the question. You can actually include those people throughout the process so that they're a part of the method, so that they're a part of these conversations about what kind of data do we want, how are you going to analyze it. And so again, I mentioned before, the kind of rethinking of what constitutes an expert in this space. Well, the people, I would say, the people who are going to be most affected by the product or the research are some kind of expert, because they're the people experiencing whatever problem it is or issue or experience that's resulting in the question. So how can they be integrated throughout the research process? And then related to this, and this is something that's becoming a really big deal in the international policy spaces with respect to data collection. I say probably the most important thing beyond general data integrity principles is to make sure that data are disaggregated by their component parts. So making sure that data is separated by gender, right? So men and women, or by race or socioeconomic status, or rural versus urban in different contexts. If you're familiar with the United Nations and their Sustainable Development Goals, they're hitting this wall presently because they don't have the data disaggregated in a way that they can actually achieve those policy goals. And so they're having to spend a lot of money to go back and get the data that's actually going to help them do that. And so I think it's a good kind of cautionary tale and good example of why data disaggregation is so important, and to be attentive to that in the data collection process, making sure that people's unique identities are reflected in the information gathered and how it's saved. So kind of a final step, I would say, for a general inclusive R&D process is to think about how the EDI principles extend to the dissemination of the final findings and the product. So And this is something that came up a lot in the roundtable from last September, making sure that the language of the findings is clear and accessible, like that the fonts used are accessible to all people, that it's not so jargony that somebody who's not a conventional expert in the space won't understand it. Not to say that the entire, I should say, there is some value to having that jargon rate depending on the audience, but in terms of making sure, the idea is to make sure that there's some kind of final product that's actually accessible. So for example, I would say to have a truly inclusive R&D process, the findings should be accessible to the people most affected by the final outcome. Now to do that, one probably can't use the language they would use among their peers, but they have to think about, how can this be presented in a way that they understand, making it available to the general public. Another really interesting point to think about, especially if somebody is creating a product or has findings that are intended to create really positive social change, is to especially engage with youth. I would say the youth are one population that should be considered throughout the R&D process, but especially when it comes to dissemination. We've seen a lot of the most powerful movements in the world in recent years to be led by young people. So how are they included in the process? How are they integrated in the final dissemination of things? It's a really important question to consider. So these are 5 basic steps. There are many other steps that could be appropriate, but I think these are 5 general ones to keep in mind as one starts to think about, okay, what could an inclusive R&D process look like? What types of things might we consider? So up to this point, we've done a lot. So we've explained what equity, diversity, and inclusion are, how they relate to each other. We've reviewed allyship as one particular pathway to acting on EDI. We've introduced 5 steps to creating an inclusive R&D process. So we've done quite a lot. So what we're going to do now is shift to small group conversations and networking. So as I said before, this portion will not be recorded, but I encourage people who are watching this recording later to consider the questions that I'm going to share. And if you can do it in a group setting, all the better. So what's going to happen is we're going to break you into groups of 3 to 4 participants. I'm not sure what we'll probably do like 12 minutes or so, because we started a few minutes late, so not 15, but close to 15. And what I'll have you do in your groups is you'll introduce yourself, so your name, your pronouns. If you're not familiar with pronouns, like as I said, mine are she, her, yours might be he, his, or they, them, your organization and why you're here, just so people in your group can get to know who you are. And then I'm going to give you a few questions to guide your conversation. You don't have to talk about them all. The point is to provide you all an opportunity to practice talking about inclusive R&D and to get a chance to bounce ideas off of people who are similarly interested in these questions. So I'll have you discuss how does or does not EDI currently factor into R&D at your organization? How would you like to see EDI integrated in R&D processes? And what challenges do you foresee or have you already experienced in integrating inclusive R&D principles at work, and how might they be overcome? And I'm going to copy and paste these in the chat momentarily. And before I give final instructions on the Zoom group, I want to give a few guiding principles for your conversations. And these are largely built on kind of the concepts of allyship that we talked about before. So in your group, I encourage you to use I statements, speaking personal experience. Remember that silence is okay. Active listening is just as important as speaking. I encourage everyone to consciously cultivate an environment where everyone is encouraged to participate. And a key part of this is being aware of how your own positionality, right? So going back to the ideas of power, privilege, and supremacy, or the lack thereof, affects your role in the conversation. So kind of this is a good way to practice how can I be an ally, right, in these group settings. So, all right. So you have those questions. So what you'll do is Zoom will automatically sort you into groups. There will be a prompt that pops up saying, time to join or join your group, and you click either like join or yes or something like that, and you will be automatically zoomed off to your group. If you have questions, there will be a button at the bottom of your screen that says like ask help, and then I will be zoomed in momentarily to help your group. So I'm going to say about 10 minutes in small groups. Again, I don't expect you to address questions, but kind of a good way to practice having conversations about inclusive R&D. So I hope you enjoy your groups, and we'll come back to a large group after that. Okay, so I think everyone was ripped from your breakout groups, and I heard some conversations continuing, which I take as a very great sign. Hopefully you all enjoyed getting to connect with each other. I know it was very brief, but I always like to say that the best conversations are those that are left unfinished, because it means that there's more to be discussed and more to be shared. So at this point, we're going to shift to a large group discussion. If you have a question or something you'd like to share, like a key point that came up in your conversation, something you learned, I welcome you to share that now. So Zoom does have a way of doing that. So if you look on your Zoom screen, there's a button that says participants at the bottom. If you click on that, then there should be an option to raise your hand, and then I'll be notified that your hand is up, and you'll be moved to the top of the queue, and I can call on you. If that is not working for you or confusing, you're also welcome to just wave your arms in front of your Zoom camera, and I will do my best to notice that as well. But yeah, so if anybody has any questions or comments at this time, they're very, very welcome. Yeah, so Joy Freeman, you're first in the queue.
Sure. So in our group, we talked about, I think it was the second question on what can be done or what should be done. And so one of the things that I share just from my experience of working in brand marketing strategy and then now doing consulting is that a huge opportunity is to include the end user up front. And not at the research stage, but at the question asking and exploration stage. Because once you get to designing research, you've already decided what you're going to do. And I think one of the big challenges when we think about research and development and EDI in it is, especially when you see this a lot in international research, is that you think you have a diverse team. But the diversity you're defining is having translators and cultural brokers who sit at the lowest rung of research. So you don't actually have diversity in the decision-making level, which means that you may answer the questions, but not realize that what you're actually doing is asking the wrong question. So you'll get good answers to the wrong question. And so I think as we think about R&D, whether it's an NGO, corporate, nonprofit, is really the need to equip people with the tools to be a part of the discovery upfront, so that we ensure that we're actually designing products, services, and goods that support their need and not the things that we are imposing on them.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Joy. I think that's a great thing for people to keep in mind in their own work going forward. So we have two other hands up, and I think that's all we're going to have time for, because we do want to end as close to on time as possible. So the first I have Amy, I'm sorry if I'm at Amy Schaffelberger, and then Harriet Lewis. So Amy? Oh, I'm sorry, Amy, you're muted.
Got it. Okay, good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Good. Actually, my name is Amy Jones. I use my maiden name professionally because it's so much easier to say. But just one comment I wanted to make, that I'm very fortunate that I work for a company that's very focused on these issues. And at least within US and North America, we have a lot of great diversity, and definitely the opportunity to do more globally. But maybe the comment I wanted to make, in the spirit of making the future better, thinking about STEM and really the focus that we're seeing down to grade schools about, everybody can enter fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that some of these issues we're grappling with, that as we start to build academic programs, that we can build in more leadership skill building, so that anybody can find their voice and recognize that they can influence all these decisions that were more point 2, 3, 4, and 5, that really starting with number 1 is the key to make sure that the leadership's there and everyone's voices are empowered. So more of a comment than a question.
No, thank you, Amy. And I think that's a good point. I mean, that's not something I really talked about here, but my hope would be that any kind of organization that focuses on inclusive R&D recognizes the need to support the programs that people come from, right? That are a part of, that are going to be a part of the inclusive R&D. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful comment. And then Harriet, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a really quick comment, and I love this conversation, and I like to focus on the E in the EDI and the equity piece. And when we're thinking about, and when we're talking about EDI and R&D and UN SDGs and things like that, and just this whole conversation about EDI in the society, you know, we're talking about a shift of power and resources. And even we're talking about, you know, EDI and R&D, the development piece, and we didn't have enough time. Our conversation started to go to, you know, a participant was talking about R&D that she has done on the ground and included Karen involved in getting the end user involved in the research. But if we're talking about sustainable goals and we're talking about inclusivity, we have to really focus on that E at the beginning, that we're trying to build power, we're trying to shift resource, and we're trying to create sustainable development. And we need to focus on the equity piece.
Thank you for that, Harriet. I think that's a good point. And part of and I mentioned before, you know, diversity and inclusion have been a part of the vocabulary, I think, a lot longer than equity has. Equity is also the hardest piece of the puzzle, right, to incorporate. So I think thank you for like amplifying the need to focus on the E and equity. Yeah, thank you for that. So we're almost at time, so I'm going to stop us there. I want to just say a few words to wrap us up. First of all, thank you all so much for joining in this conversation. It was our first time doing a workshop of this nature, and I hope the interactive component went well. Based on what people were sharing, I think the small groups went really well, and people were able to learn from each other, even if it was just for a brief moment. Yeah, so just say thank you to you all for joining us. I hope this was helpful. The toolkit resources available on our website. You're also welcome to reach out to me if you want to at any point in time. And I know the council has a lot of digital programs coming up. So feel free to participate in those. And yes, I'm just so encouraged to hear you all so invested in this topic, and to know that so many other people are passionate about incorporating EDI principles in their work, especially in the R&D space. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your contributions, for listening, for participating. And I hope you all have as good a day as these days. So thank you. Thank you so much.